Okay, welcome back. It's my great pleasure to introduce panel 2. Andrew Pettifat, I should have made sure that I knew how to pronounce your last name. Apologies, Andrew. Hope I didn't garble it too badly. How do you pronounce it?
I say pretty fat, but you can say how you like. You know,
okay.
Over the years, it's been many pronunciations. So.
Okay, yeah, you're right. So you're accustomed to many variations,
yeah.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
So Andrew is the chair of the Internet Watch Foundation, which has the mission of preventing child sex abuse online. And he's also the founder or board member of a number of other organizations that foster human rights online and that foster the ethical use of data. Jonathan Mayer is assistant professor of computer science at Princeton. He's served as chief technologist of the FCC's Enforcement Bureau and has contributed a broad range of scholarship and public commentary that helps adapt policy to technology and vice versa. And he's also trained in law. Alan Rosenstein is associate professor of law at the University of Minnesota and senior editor at Lawfare. He has served as an attorney advisor in the Office of Law and Policy in the National Security Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. And this panel is here to discuss the Apple CSAM program. That is the program in which Apple uses automated scanning of images that are held in its users' iCloud and checks them against databases of known child pornography in order to detect, sort of affirmatively find or proactively find sex abuse images and people who traffic in them. So before I launch into the substance, I do want to remind the audience that this panel will use the CSAM program as a key case study. And as a result, we are going to be discussing the grim reality of child sex abuse and the internet's role in the problem. So although we don't need to discuss the details of any particular incident of abuse, we're asking Andrew to shed some light on the severity and magnitude of the problem. And so as a result, I expect some of this conversation to be disturbing, as reasonable people will be and ought to be disturbed by the problem, by understanding the problem itself. So please consider this before staying on for the rest of the panel. If you want to skip it and meet us in panel 3, that's perfectly fine. We'll begin that one at 1:30. But I hope for those of you who understand, I think it's going to be a really important and valuable panel here. So on that note, I would like to start exactly there with Apple's decision to roll out this program. They knew, I'm sure, that they were getting into some controversy, at least among civil liberty groups. And so I'd like to understand why a company like Apple that stakes its reputation on privacy decided to proceed with this program. So Andrew, can you tell us a bit about the current state of affairs in the black market and trafficking of child pornography?
Sure. I mean, there are a number of organizations that try and track and work within industry to identify CSAM images and remove them. We're one of the major ones. NCMEC in America is probably the largest, based in DC. In our own case, we found through a variety of means, from public reporting to our own crawlers, around 150,000 URLs that contained images of children being sexually abused, illegal images. And some of those URLs could contain hundreds of images. So it's not just there are 150,000 images, there could be several million images that are out there. We found it in terms of breaking down, most of them are girls, a very, very small number of boys, at 95% of girls. About 10% of children under 2 years old. And of those, the majority, 9 out of 10, are the most severe kinds of penetrated or rape abuse. So there is a particularly shocking and awful segment, although all of these things are obviously involve the exploitation and often the rape of children online for men's pleasure. We don't know how many men are seeking to access these things. Our own best estimates, and we consult with law enforcement who deal with child protection as well, are that in the UK alone, something like 300,000 to 500,000 men are actively seeking to access images of children being abused. We have a population of 60 million, 65 million. The US has a population of 320 million plus, so you could factor it in. You could assume, unless there's something exceptional, that there's over 1.5 million US men trying to access images. And that pattern is repeated generally across the developed world. It's not so common in the global south, the majority of the overwhelming majority of the girls being pictured are white. We think that means, because of the nature of the abuse, that the overwhelming majority of people who are accessing it are white. They're likely to be quite educated, reasonably affluent. Classic profile is a man who has a minor position of authority, police officer, school teacher, scoutmaster, who has developed a sexual interest in younger people in the exercise of authority. So we certainly know from the profile of the offenders who report that that's a significant problem. The scale of the abuse is such that there's no policing way out of this. You can't catch every man. If you caught every man accessing an illegal image, the courts, certainly in our country and in your country, would simply break down by the sheer volume. They wouldn't be able to process the numbers. So prevention, interception, and blocking images is a key part of the strategy to stop the most vulnerable children in society experiencing some of the most horrific human rights abuse. And this is a human rights issue. The treatment of the abuse of children is a human rights issue. Now, what's happening generally across the internet world is an increasing move towards an encrypted environment. And obviously, as you encrypt end-to-end, and one of the things that Apple was going to introduce was more end-to-end encryption in Safari. So alongside this measure in relation to children, it was also increasing the level of encryption and security it provides. And obviously, as you encrypt, the value of URLs, or the ability to find open URLs of children, disappears. I mean, they just diminish. And so the technology that's been developed and is widely used is called PhotoDNA. It's the hashing technique that Apple are planning to use on their mobile phone. And that really takes an image, turns it into a digital footprint. And that digital footprint is then unique to that image. And you use that digital footprint to compare to similar digital footprints you might harvest elsewhere to see if there's a match. So that becomes, how to deploy, whether you can deploy these hashes in an encrypted environment without, if you like, violating people's privacy, without viewing their images, because in the case of the Apple technology, no image would be viewed. It would simply, the images you try, and they weren't going to inspect iCloud, actually. They were only inspecting images being uploaded to iCloud. There was no plan to scan iCloud itself, only the uploads. But the idea was that each image would be translated to a digital footprint and compared to a digital footprint in an existing database. And if the numbers being uploaded exceeded a certain number, we don't know what, I think probably 20 or 30, at that stage, Apple would intercede and probably report that to law enforcement. So the hash technology becomes probably the only way you can manage in an encrypted environment to detect CSAM. But obviously, whether you can deploy it without breaking encryption is the debate. I guess the debate we'll have tonight. And if you can, how can you? And I think what Apple were trying to do was find a way that was as security conscious as possible and as privacy conscious as possible, while still enabling the detection of CSAM. And CSAM is one of the big motivations behind internet regulation in most of the developed kind of so-called democratic world. And I think one of the problems is that among the digital privacy community, there's very little understanding, whether that's conscious or unconscious, of the scale of child abuse and the suffering that's inflicted on children. And I think that and I'm conflicted because I support greater encryption. I think there's big advantages to encryption, obviously. I probably wouldn't need to say that in an audience like this. But I'm afraid of a move to encryption that is made at the expense of children and made at the expense of tens or thousands and hundreds of thousands of children. And in some cases, there's a very kind of colonial element to this. So live streaming of children being abused online is very common in Indonesia and the Philippines, with children being made available to Western consumers on encrypted channels for them to purchase. And children as young as 5 or younger are frequently sold online to Western consumers. And this is the kind of thing that I think, whether the Apple technology is correct or not, the question in front of the internet world, internet industry is, if this isn't the right answer, what is the right answer? Because it is not acceptable in the child protection world to say that children should simply suffer as the price that we pay for having a more encrypted and private environment. That's essentially the argument.
Okay, great. So I know Andrew already laid out some of the details about how the program works, but Jonathan, do you want to add anything in terms of explaining what Apple exactly is doing and what its kind of options are, I guess, in terms of the technology here?
Thanks, Jane, and thanks for the invitation to join today. Let me try to give a little more technical detail about how these hashing methods work today and what exactly Apple has proposed. And I'm sure we'll get into later lots of discussion about the upsides and downsides of what Apple's proposed. The challenge that hashing methods try to solve is enabling online services to identify at large scale images that are known to be child sexual abuse material, or CSAM. These methods are most commonly applied to images. You can apply them to types of content that aren't images, but I'm going to focus on images. So the way this works today is most online services have access to the images that users upload. In cryptography jargon, that's called having plain text access, as opposed to having ciphertext access. And online services can scan those images on their servers. The term for that is usually server-side scanning. Using server-side scanning, there are two approaches to hashing that are common. One is cryptographic hashing, where an image gets turned into a number, and if that number is previously known to be CSAM, the image gets flagged for review and then eventual reporting to child safety groups or law enforcement. The limitation of cryptographic hashing is that images can subtly change. So I think this is probably like the most controversial thing I'm going to say. I think anyone on this panel is going to say, you might reformat an image from a JPEG to a GIF or a GIF, very controversial. And that can change the image, right? And so you want a hashing function that has some ability to account for that. Or you might rescale an image, for example, or tweak the colors in an image, rotate it slightly, right? You don't want that to break the detection method. And so the way to account for those changes in images is perceptual hashing, where you turn an image into a number, just like with cryptographic hashing, except with the special property that similar images have the same number or a similar number, right? So if the image is slightly reformatted or rescaled or so on, that's not going to prevent hashing from identifying similar images. The most commonly used perceptual hash function for identifying CSAM is Microsoft Photo DNA. It's widely used by online services. There are a number of other perceptual hash functions, and outside of the CSAM context, other hash functions are commonly used. There are some important limitations of hash matching. I mentioned this is only for identifying known images, right? So it's not going to identify new images. It's also not difficult for a determined adversary to evade, right? If someone wants to tweak their image enough to change the hash, or just wants to encrypt their data before uploading, this isn't going to catch that. Right? The goal here is to identify users who make a mistake or who aren't overly sophisticated, and it's very effective. There's hash matching methods clearly lead to identifying a number of people who share CSAM. Okay, so that brings me to Apple's proposal, which is a new approach to perceptual hashing. It's one of 3 new child safety features that Apple recently announced. And the idea here is to provide CSAM detection based on hash matching for iCloud photos. That's Apple's photo syncing and sharing service that you pretty much have to sign up for, right? Like I think if you don't sign up for it, they're going to nag you every day on the phone settings screen until you sign up for it. So that's iCloud photos. iCloud photos is not end-to-end encrypted. Apple actually has access to the plain text for photos uploaded to iCloud photos. But what Apple's trying to do here is limit the circumstances in which it'll look at the plain text of photos. As I'm sure we'll get into quite a bit later, what they've decided here has tremendous implications for end-to-end encrypted services that Apple does offer or might offer in future, or that other online services provide. Okay, so there are 2 key steps in what Apple has done. One is a new perceptual hash function called neural hash. So this is an alternative to photo DNA. The way neural hash works is much more sophisticated than other hash functions. It includes a machine learning step, which is new for perceptual hash functions. But ultimately, the overall properties are the same. Similar images hashed to the same number. That is the goal. Apple's second contribution here is a new protocol for hash matching that is partly on device. So the terminology that's often used there is client side, and partly server side. So this is a move from purely server side to partly client side and partly server side. And the protocol provides some privacy properties guaranteed through cryptography. Those privacy properties are, first, the client can't learn the hashes in the hash database. Right? You don't want people to know which hashes are known to law enforcement and child safety groups, because that can reveal sources and methods and enable evasion. Second, the server, your Apple, can't learn anything about non-matching images, right? The idea here is you're not giving up privacy in that sense when you share an innocent image. Apple has a step called thresholding. So they don't learn about every matching image. They learn when there are enough matching images. They've said that's going to start at 30 images. That might change over time. And if there are enough matching images, then Apple learns that a threshold has been reached, and it gets a low resolution copy of each of the matching images. Apple then reviews those images. If they're CSAM, it submits a report to NCMEC with the low resolution images that are CSAM. And then finally, CSAM might share that with law enforcement, and law enforcement might come back with a warrant to learn more about the user or other forms of criminal process. Okay, that is my super quick sketch of the technical details here. Happy to go into that in more detail later, but I'll pass the mic.
Yeah, thanks. So we're going to get normative pretty quickly, but I wanted to ask all of you, maybe Jonathan might be in the best position, but are you aware of this sort of application using, whether it's using hashed images or just some kind of known database of bad stuff being applied to other types of crimes or other, like, is there any precedent for this kind of a program?
I think WhatsApp used scan text for spam on device.
Okay, spam, right.
Yeah, so there are, I think this is, it's not the same obviously, but I think there are precedents for device side scanning certain things by some companies.
Okay, yeah. And then think about the limitations of the current Apple system. One of them that Jonathan mentions is the kind of fragility, so to speak, that slight changes in an image would make the hash sufficiently different to not match. Is there any potential for machine learning applications that can actually learn what even CSAM that's never been detected and in the past might look like? Is that in discussion or in the works right now?
We use machine learning to identify potential new images, but they're always reviewed by a human analyst before the URLs are supplied to companies. So we don't believe that machine learning is yet sophisticated enough to detect a new image. We think that human analysts have to finally make that final decision. Once that's agreed, then you can hash the image and make it available digitally. But I don't believe, but I mean, different organizations do use algorithms and rely on those to identify images. We don't think at IWF that's accurate enough. And the risk is you remove images that are legal and acceptable. I mean, even if they're offensive to people, they're still legal.
A couple of particular challenges for implementing machine learning in this space, which has generated interest, but not yet viable technical solutions. And there don't appear to be viable technical solutions on the horizon. Are first, training machine learning in this space is very difficult. You need access to CSAM images that, at least in the United States, presents some significant legal barriers. And then second, implementing machine learning with the types of privacy guarantees that Apple is trying to provide here is exceptionally difficult, right? You'd have to provide a machine learning model where the client can't try to reverse engineer that model into examples of CSAM images where the client actually doesn't learn the output of the model, right? That's by design not something that the client's supposed to learn. It's very complicated very quickly. And again, there just aren't viable technical approaches that folks seem to see on the horizon there.
Great. Okay. Okay. So I'm curious what each of you think about, although I can infer to some extent, what you think of the whether a program like Apple's is a legitimate or good use of its authority and market power. I'm going to start with Alan. So what was your, actually, I'm curious to know what your initial reaction was to this news breaking, and then what over time you've come to think about a program of this sort.
Yeah, my initial response was kind of jaw-dropping, not because of the program itself, but because of who was behind it, that it was Apple in particular. That kind of blew my mind a little bit. Before becoming a law professor, I worked at DOJ in the National Security Division, and I was, involved, let's say, in the 2016 fight over the Apple FBI San Bernardino iPhone, the Apple iPhone that was recovered in the 2016 San Bernardino in 2016, and that there was this big fight between Apple and the FBI over. And say what you will about whether Apple was right or wrong. I have my own views about that. They certainly were very passionate in their defense of encryption and their pretty strong line against anything that would, in their view, weaken it. And to see that company only 5 years later turn around and do something that pretty obviously, I mean, whether or not it undermines end-to-end encryption, there's a lot of sort of semantic quibbling there, but clearly is a huge retreat from the idea that any accommodation to law enforcement or safety, to public safety with respect to encryption was inappropriate. I'm hesitant to say what I think about the program overall. I mean, my intuition is that it's a reasonable idea. I am not a computer scientist. I'm enough of a hobbyist programmer to know how difficult this field actually is. And so I defer to people with PhDs in it, like Jonathan, right? And so when they say there are some serious potential risks here, I take that very seriously. What to me is clear, not just from looking at this debate, but from having followed this issue for, a long time now and having, written some law review articles about it, is that the issue of anything related to encryption is kind of the classic wicked policy problem, which is to say that although it sometimes presents, and obviously there are some obvious technical elements to it that folks like Jonathan and others are working on, at the end of the day, the resolution is not itself a technical question, right? You have essentially a bunch of deeply second best or eighth best outcomes, all of which have enormous risks, all of which have a lot of uncertainty, all of which impinge on different, very sincerely held, and in some cases incommensurable values between privacy, child safety, whatever, pick your value here. And so we should not expect this to be a decision where there will be some obviously right answer or not, right? And again, this is not limited in any way to encryption, right? In some sense, all of our most difficult public policy questions, including those that intersect with issues of science and technology, have this flavor, whether it's what the appropriate social response to a pandemic is, or what the appropriate response to something like climate change is. And although you need to have technical experts to advise you, right? You need to know from technologists about the effects on encryption. You need to know from child safety experts. At the end of the day, this is not something in which there will be a technical, let me put it this way, this is not a situation in which there will be a objective technical resolution, right? The example that I've always found very useful is we've had hundreds of years in figuring out how to, let's say, build bridges. And so if you tell someone, I want you to build a bridge from point A to point B, there's usually an answer of how to build this bridge, right? And there may be a couple of answers, but there's sort of an objective expertise often. But that is usually not the difficult problem. The difficult problem is what kind of bridge, where should we build it? Should we prioritize cars or pedestrians or trains? Why are we building a bridge? What about the environmental impacts? And as a society, if we've gotten better at answering those questions, it's because we've gotten more sophisticated at dealing with the trade-offs, not because we've somehow magicked our way out of the trade-offs themselves. So this is a very frustratingly meta answer to your question, which I totally get. But having been knocking my head against this issue for, and related issues for 5 years, and many people have been knocking their heads for much longer than I have, this is the kind of humility that I have come to. So I personally, when I read the details, it seemed like a fairly reasonable trade-off. But that's me speaking as Alan Rosenstein, right, with my idiosyncratic priors. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer here.
Well, okay, I'm gonna ask you for some for some more specifics, if you don't mind, though.
Sure.
Because I get that there are risks that need to be traded off, but I think one potential response, at least to Apple's system, is that they did magic their way out of a risk that would have existed without this hashing technique. What I mean is that Apple has at least presented this as a fairly as a privacy preserving way to identify bad images while remaining ignorant and blind to otherwise private images. So first of all, anyone on the panel can take issue with that description of it, but I first want to just lay out what are the risks to society of a company or a government taking on a project of this sort. And I guess on the other side of the ledger would be the risks from not using the technology in this way. And then maybe we can inch our way towards figuring out what when it makes sense to prioritize one sort of risk over the other. So what are the risks from this specific problem, Alan?
Yeah, no, sure. There are a bunch, right? I mean, there's the general risk, and again, I think Jonathan here can speak in more specifics of this very complex system introducing vulnerabilities, right? Any time you build complexity into a system, you're making it harder to do well, right? If we've learned anything in the last 40 years of developing, computer systems, right? It's that it is very hard to develop stuff without vulnerabilities. It's very hard to identify all the second and third and fourth order effects. And so, the moment you go from something that is, relatively straightforward, like this is encrypted and no one can read it, which by the way is not itself straightforward at all to do well, to this is encrypted and no one can read it, except these people can read it. If these things happen and then those things happen, it could work, right? But you've made it more complicated, right? So there's always just that basic idea that complexity is the enemy of security, right? Which is this sort of, I don't know, one of the axioms of computer security, as I understand, right? The other another risk and something that I think is totally fair to grapple with is there's nothing special about CSAM in the sense of building a capacity for client-side scanning, right? Once you build a capacity for client-side scanning for CSAM, you can build it for anything, right? Anything in which you can create a database of hashes and then do kind of fuzzy matching so that you can get around the fact that people can change parts of the information. So this could start at CSAM, but then you could creep out to things that maybe we're not so comfortable with having this level of surveillance, copyrighted information, for example, or quote unquote terrorist content, right? And I say quote unquote not because I don't think that there's such a thing as bad terrorist content, but terrorist content is much less of an objective we can all agree on it than something like CSAM, right? The problem is not simply there that you're creating potentially more surveillance, but that by automating it, you are creating a society not only in which lawbreakers are punished, but lawbreakers can't even act, right? And that is a level of social control that actually goes far beyond simply catching all the bad guys. Now, again, in the case of CSAM, right, I think if we could wave a wand and say, nope, no one can look at CSAM, no one can create CSAM, even if you want to, you're not allowed to. That's probably level of social control where I at least am comfortable with, and I suspect many people are. But of course, there's no guarantee that you stay there, right? Now, to me, if your question is, well, what's to keep the United States government from imposing, using the system for nefarious ends? The answer is, well, I don't know, the United States Constitution and hundreds of years of liberal democracy, et cetera, and I'm comfortable with that in Europe, and I'm comfortable with that in Japan and Korea and other kind of advanced liberal democracies, right? But what about other countries? Now, often the example that I think is trotted out is, well, the moment Apple does this here, or the moment a Western company undermines encryption for its host government, China is going to come calling and demand the same thing, right? Now, I think that's actually a red herring. China's going to do whatever it wants to do. China's not waiting for anyone's permission here. Neither do I think it's a country like Russia, for example. But you have actually, I think, a good number of countries kind of in the middle, right? They are not fully authoritarian countries, but they're also not countries that have, let's say, the greatest rule of law histories, right? So in that sense, what Apple does in the United States is, I think, quite impactful onto, I'm going to pick a random country here. Indonesia might be a good example. I'm not trying to pick on Indonesia, right? But countries in which actually they are waiting, they're not actually going to move first, and in which the behavior of a company like Apple might make a difference, right? So these are all huge risks. I mean, these are huge risks, right? And we should not pretend otherwise. The question is, are they worth it?
Great. Okay, so what I've gotten so far from Alan, and I want to invite others to join, is the security risks, the building capacity for client-side surveillance that can then engage in scope creep, social control, which I think is a sort of separate factor, that this is potentially at least a tool for limiting action, not just being able to detect and enforce later after the fact, right? Ex ante social control. And then the international application or uses of something where the proof of concept has been proven in the US. Anything else we should add to that list?
If I could riff a little more on the broader use or misuse of this technology, and then add a couple points beyond that. I think it's fair to say that has been the leading criticism of Apple's proposal, and the particular scenario, as Alan sketched, that has gotten a lot of mind share is what happens when China asks Apple to use this for pro-democracy content or other content that we would consider core protected political speech in the US and in Western democracies. I'll part ways with Alan some in viewing the China example as a red herring. I think this is a very complex area of policy and politics involving a number of barriers to foreign government action, some of which are technical and some of which are very not technical. And the closer we get to norms of scanning, client-side scanning in particular, scanning of images in particular, deploying that technology out to devices, the fewer barriers there are to a government demand to implement that. This is something of a prediction about what China would be willing to do, but I think at minimum it's fair to say the barriers to making the ask are just different when it's please add these hashes to the database that you already have and have already released in the United States, rather than please build an entirely new infrastructure to enable identifying pro-democracy content on user devices. So I think the risk of misuse in countries that aren't committed to democracy is greater in my mind than it is for Alan. I would also add to what I thought was very helpful in Alan's sort of taxonomy of how different countries might think about this, that there can be concerns about democratic countries, right? Defamation, for example, in Western Europe works very differently from in the United States. Nazi imagery in some countries in Western Europe, very controversial, of course, but in the United States, that would be content protected by the First Amendment. It's unlawful in certain democracies. So Alan touched on intellectual property, among other categories. Just wanted to amplify that you could have these cross-border disputes about what kind of content should go into the database, even among democratic countries. Okay, so that's the broader use and misuse issue I wanted to riff on. Let me add a couple more categories of concern. One is false positives, right? So you might match accounts that you don't want to match. That could be unintentional. So for example, neural hash is a new perceptual hash function. It hasn't been well studied yet. There is some reason to believe false positives are going to be very infrequent, but that needs more study. There could also be intentional false positives, where someone generates images that trigger neural hash matches, but the images themselves look pretty innocuous. And thinking about how easy that is to do and what the consequences are is going to be important for a system like this. Okay, so that's the false positive issue. And then the last issue I wanted to raise is efficacy. So I think there is no reason to doubt the efficacy of perceptual hashing as a method to identify CSAM. It clearly works today. It protects children, and it's an important tool of several tools to protect children. But Apple's implementation is different in a variety of ways that may lead it to be less effective than other implementations of perceptual hashing. So Apple has said, for example, that it's going to combine hash sets across countries and only use hashes that appear in multiple countries' hash sets. That's going to mean fewer hashes than are typically used today. The neural hash perceptual hash function seems to be more brittle than some hash functions that are used today, so that could make detection more less likely. There's this thresholding component, which is unique to Apple's system of, you have to have 30 images before you trigger the system. So that's going to mean people with 29 images are not probably going to get detected. And then there are a couple other design features in Apple's system that similarly introduce false negatives. So there's some reasons to be curious about how effective Apple system is going to be in comparison to alternative perceptual hash function systems. And as a corollary to that, I think there are a lot of open questions about what the alternatives are and whether this direction makes sense as opposed to other directions, like user reporting, for example, which has been increasingly positioned as a direction that companies should pursue as an alternative to this. WhatsApp uses user reporting for its end-to-end encrypted communication, has generated a number of reports about CSAM material, but user reporting is also very limited. I see Andrew shaking his head, so I'm just going to go ahead and pass the baton to Andrew. Tell us why user reporting isn't the way to go.
Well, user reporting accounts for maybe 5% of the images that we find, and 90% of the user reports we get are not illegal images at all. They're pornography or legal sexual activity. And so it bogs down, if you've got human analysts as we do, it bogs them down in processing endless reports that are actually perfectly legal and stops them focusing on the hashing and identifying genuine legal images. And to be honest, the idea that groups of men sharing images of children are going to suddenly report the fact that they're sharing those images is frankly stupid. I mean, the majority of people who perpetrate and circulate this imagery are doing so because they want to circulate it among like-minded people. They're not going to report it. And the ability to stumble across CSAM accidentally, it's actually very limited. People like to say, I found it. Oh, I turned on my computer and I found it. I would defy most people listening to this to say you've ever stumbled across an actual illegal image of a children being sexually abused because you were browsing, I don't know, browsing some innocent site. It's people who want this, go looking for it. And quite often the user reports that are accurate are people who have come across an illegal image, have been looking for an illegal image, come across a splash page from someone like us saying, this image is illegal, you need to sort of not be looking at this. And then they report it because they feel guilty or because they feel if they report it, it avoids them being the subject of police action. So user reporting is not a mechanism to detect the significant volume of child abuse that we deal with. And the kinds of examples, I agree with both of what you said. I thought both of you have set out, Jonathan, a really, really good, solid technical explanation, and Alan, a really good kind of policy and legal, policy framework. And I have no disagreements with anything you said. What I would say is the fact of throwing the equation, It's an efficacy we don't know because it hasn't been launched yet. We'd have to test that. We'd like to work with Apple on the database, for example, on the hash set, because we're very comfortable about the hash set we've got. Because we have an arrangement with UK law enforcement to hash their images and check them, we will end up with probably 2.5 million hashes neural hashes that we can make available. That's a pretty solid basis. And we know that, the majority of the hashes are the same. The majority of images our analysts see are the same images, actually. They're repeat images. So actually the repeat image, a common image, it's very, very common in child sex abuse to see the same image time and time again, to a point where our analysts can see the beginning of a thumbnail and they know exactly which image this is because it's repetitious. So I think it will be a significant step forward. It won't be the perfect solution. There is no perfect solution. This is like, plugging a hole in a dam that's leaking. There's always be, if there's a demand for child sex abuse material, there will be supply. And it's like the drug problem. At the end of the day, you have to change demand. And my big beef is we need to talk much more about why men want to access these images and how we prevent men going from accessing pornography, as they do in their teens and early 20s, into consuming images of children being sexually abused. That to me is the key here. And technical solutions or policy solutions are just making, are just holding the dam against that. But this will be a significant advance, in my opinion. You can weigh it against some of those other dangers. Whether other countries would then demand the technology be built, well, that would be a decision for Apple. If Indonesia, say, build us a hash set that can detect, say, radical Islamic images, because we've got a problem of Islamic insurrection in some of the islands of Indonesia, it's then a decision for Apple to decide whether it wants to build that technology. And that's a decision for that company. It doesn't have to do it. And the photo DNA technology is so common now, so widely used. There's no reason why any country couldn't ask Apple to build it now anyway. It doesn't need a CSAM example for a country to say, I would like to be able to detect client-side images of this or client-side text, so could you build it? The idea that introducing CSAM into the mix is suddenly going to trigger a massive flood for repressive or semi-authoritarian governments, I don't see it. I've lived with the slippery slope argument for a long time. In my country, we introduced race hate laws, which would not be common in the US jurisdiction, but which prohibited violence and hate speech against ethnic minorities. And at the time, lots of people said, well, it's a slippery slope. We'll have a restriction on speech following on from that. And actually, it never followed on. From 1968 on, that law was kept very tight to only protect ethnic minorities from violent and racist hatred. The slippery slope never happened. So I'm very dubious about some of these arguments, which are always speculative and are always set against the actual harm being done to hundreds of thousands of children as we speak. That is going on. And some of those children, when you've seen the images that I see the images as part of my role. And if you sit through a session when you see the kind of images I've seen, which I won't repeat for reasons the chair says will be quite disturbing for people, although I could easily disturb people a great deal by reading those images, you know that something has to be done. You know that this is not something you can just say, well, this is not the right solution, there needs to be something else. We need to identify what that is to protect children now. And the child, one final thing, in the context of the online safety bill in the UK, which is very controversial in lots of aspects, there was an attempt by some of the privacy groups to meet with child protection groups to agree a common front. And the child protection group's response was, you collude with child abuse, so we've no interest in talking to you. Now that kind of division, the deep, deep division that's emerging between the child protection community and the privacy community is actually very damaging to any serious attempt to preserve an open internet. And it requires movement on both sides to understand each other's perspective and trying to identify common ground. And part of it, I would hope, going back to Alan said, I would hope part of the solution is technical, is to find a technical solution, but a technical solution combined with some policy and legal guarantees.
So I understood Jonathan's efficacy addition to the list maybe slightly differently, or at least I'm not, it seems to me that it could be that Apple's detection system does not, if we compare it to other tools that granted have not solved the problem, but that chip away at it. If we compare it to the other tools that exist, it may not wind up adding as much value as we're all hoping today it does. And actually, you said something that I wanted to ask about. If the images that are that are routinely found through something like this are the images you see over and over again, I wonder whether a program like this actually gets to the the goal of primary importance of preventing new images, new sex abuse to occur. Do you see what I mean? Like,
it doesn't. No, absolutely. And Jonathan said it anyway. These only detect, the Apple technology will only detect known CSAM images which have been hashed. So new images or new material won't, and if that's uploaded to iCloud on your phone, the Apple technology won't detect it. That's absolutely right.
So how does that stop it? So if there are a bunch of old images that, if the database that you help build does not get new images added very often, and what Apple is mostly detecting are old images that have been circulating for a while, does something like the detection program actually make a dent in the production of new images?
Only, well, we would be looking through our own engineering for new images, as we do all the time. And if we find them and establish that they're illegal, we will hash them. And if we have a relationship with Apple, we provide that hash to the Apple database. So that the Apple technology won't find new images, but other organizations.
I get that, but so I'm wondering though, how efficacious is this?
May I offer a thought on that, Jane? Yeah. So I mean, I think the answer is that it's a demand question, right? I mean, what the Apple, I mean, well, it's a demand. It's a, I mean, I don't know. I'm going to get it's going to lower demand for CSAM if suddenly, a large portion of internet users, and as Andrew put it, to the extent that CSAM users are predominantly in the developed world, and they're predominantly educated, and they're predominantly of some level of income, right? That is a big part of Apple's target audience, or sorry, that is a big part of the demographic of Apple users, not Apple's target audience, obviously, but the sorts of people that buy Apple iPhones, right? The developed world, and they have a certain income. If those people know that they cannot use their phones to use CSAM, then some of them will switch to Android, right? But then we'll just have this Android question in 6 months, right? But some of them will be presumably dissuaded, right? And so this question is, what's on the margin, the demand effects, and there's also supply effects, right? Because presumably the people that create this imagery and traffic in it want to distribute it as widely as possible. Again, we get to the question of what is the effect on the margin. I don't know, but I'm sure it's not zero.
Right.
Let me add that. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Another way in which detecting known images can be effective in preventing the creation of new imagery and rescuing children from dangerous circumstances is that you just have co-occurrence, right? People who are abusing children, who are creating new images, may also be the same people who have previously known images. And there are plenty of instances where law enforcement, using hash matching methods, has subsequently rescued a child from dangerous circumstances for that very reason. I'd like to suggest part of what's going on in this conversation is sort of bringing to a surface the lack of data around this issue. Andrew discussed how, in his experience, hash matching leads to identifying the vast majority of images that his group flags for law enforcement. There is some public data from NCMEC that suggests, in their experience, the vast majority of what they flag to law enforcement is actually new media. It's not previously known images. There's a study NCMEC did in collaboration with Google recently that had data on that. The results were very limited and subject to some interpretation, but I think there's clearly just a much a need for much more understanding of this problem to inform the trade-offs we're going to have to make here. And I think there's maybe some room for the kind of common ground Andrew was describing in groups that come at this from a child safety perspective, groups that come at this from a privacy perspective, from a free speech perspective, academic researchers, to collaborate on developing much more data to understand what interventions might be most efficacious.
That's great. And I was going to ask you all about how to get the right level of transparency or auditing or just data on the efficacy and risks that are involved in a system like this. So Alan, do you have thoughts on that?
Well, so yeah, and specifically, I wanted to sort of echo Jonathan's point about the need for more data, and then to, I think, go even farther. There's a need for not just data, but actual experimentation, right? So I think one of the problems with a lot of these debates is that they end up very theoretical. Like, people are trying to derive conclusions from what is fundamentally a question about how this will work in the wild, right? On both a technical and policy and political level. So the question is, I don't sadly have anything smart to say about this, but the question is, is there a way to develop small scale experiments where we can test questions like efficacy, where we can test questions like the political effects of this? Now, unfortunately, and this is a kind of characteristic of these kinds of wicked problems, it's hard to have good, clean experiments that have very cabined effects. If what you are concerned about, I am less concerned about this, but I get that this is a totally legitimate concern. If what you're concerned about is that when Apple does this, it will now set a precedent, right? Then that's going to set a precedent whether or not it's a small experiment or a big experiment, right? But on the other hand, is there a way to develop a scanning solution, right? Or that can be rolled out on a small number of devices, and we run that for 6 months, and we get some data, and then we decide whether to expand it, right? Again, I don't know if the answer to that. I don't know what the answer to that is, but that is, I think, one way of trying to get some data. Be more empirical about this.
Andrew, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say, if you look at our annual report, you'll find it's very rich in data in terms of the profile, the numbers of URLs we find, the profile, the level of severity, age breakdown, and so on. We also publish the main sources and the main hosts of material. And actually, it would probably surprise most people to know that nearly 80% of the world's CSAM material is hosted in the Netherlands, in one country, on a series of image hosting and cyberlocker companies. And the major social media companies, big tech, if you like, is not a significant carrier of illegal images of children being sexually abused. In fact, all of the big companies have, I think, quite serious and dedicated teams that are working to eliminate and remove or block the material from being on their platforms. And so I just want to acknowledge that, because they get a lot of criticism, and some cases correctly. But in the field of CSAM, I think no company wants CSAM on its platform. No big respectable company wants CSAM on its platform. And I think Apple are responding to what they feel is a genuine issue in the terms of growing encryption in coming up with this method. So I think we've got quite a bit of data, but actually I liked what both Jonathan and Alan said about the need to have much more granular data in front of people. And I loved Alan's idea of trying to find a forum for trying small scale iterative approaches that could, and if we could pull together a genuine coalition of privacy and child protection groups with some serious engineering heft through hackathons or whatever, to say, can we crack this in a way that doesn't undermine democratic and free speech values, I think that would be a tremendous step forward. And one of my and I come from a human rights, I come from a free expression background. I used to run a group called Article 19, which is international free expression organization. So it's a tremendous frustration to me to see the division between the child protection and the privacy communities. And I would love to see that bridged, and for there to be some collaboration in trying to find genuine answers that meet both teams' objectives. And I think, Alan, you said there will never be a perfect solution. There will be a set of imperfect solutions which won't satisfy everybody, but a set of imperfect solutions which do something for both privacy and to protect children would be better than where we are now, I think.
Yeah, so let me probe a little further on this idea of running experiments. I think one type of data that, Andrew, you probably don't have, or you're not able to report yet, at least, are data on, for example, false positives, and then certainly some of the risks that we've described so far of if you build it, will they come and will other governments demand for other uses? And that's the sort of thing that an experiment could draw out. Two potential problems I see, and I'd like to know your thoughts. One is that these type of experiments are a public perception disaster for the companies that do them. I mean, if you think about how much media exposure and criticism Facebook got for its experiments, I'm not sure. Ironically, we've set up a system where companies might be more willing to roll out a program for everyone than to roll it out for a small number of people. So I'm curious what you think about that. The other thing that seems relevant here is that when it comes to a program like this, efficacy improves over time. And so what do we do with even a certain, what do we do with output if we know that with further effort and with more time in the wild or in the field, it might be improved in terms of efficacy or false positive rate or whatnot? Thoughts, Jonathan? I'll randomly select you if you have.
Well, I'm professionally obligated to be in favor of experimentation, but I guess I want to temper optimism about what experimentation gets us. I think that experimentation in some instances is feasible. There might be the right alignment of incentives, and there might not be a significant drawback to conducting the experiment itself. And so the experiment makes sense. Let me give an example of that. I think it would be helpful if Apple rolled out a user reporting feature in iMessage and iCloud Photos, and users could report when, for example, someone messaged them an instance of CSAM, or when someone shared with them a photo library that included CSAM. Report that to Apple. Apple would take a look and then send it on to NCMEC if it was CSAM. Because we don't know how effective it is, right? I mean, Andrew has a hypothesis that would be of limited efficacy. Facebook suggests it would be of significant efficacy, and that's the direction they're pursuing for WhatsApp. Let's find out, right? That seems like a good example of an experiment that I don't think anyone's going to be opposed to Apple enabling this type of new feature, right? It doesn't interact with encryption in the way that this particular, the CSAM proposal I previously made does. And that'll be a new fact. Or let me give you another example of an experiment where I could see the incentives aligning and there not being sort of broader implications necessarily of rolling out client-side scanning for some users. You could imagine simulating the efficacy of client-side scanning on the server side, right? So you could have systems that do server-side scanning, but that play out, let's suppose we did Apple's system using neural hash, using this thresholding and other protections built into their system, rather than what we're doing today. And let's ask the question, what will we not have flagged under that system that we did flag under our current system? And that could be a valuable contribution as well. So I do see room for experimentation, but I don't think we're going to experiment our way out of the drawbacks of at all deploying client-side scanning. I don't see a good technical path forward for addressing the broader use and misuse risks of client-side scanning. Or as Jane put it, scope creep. My background is my research group actually tried to solve this problem. We built a system very similar to Apple's. We tried to come up with a way to solve it. And where we landed was we did not see a good way of technically limiting the hash database to CSAM. We did come up with some ways of giving confidence that the hash database originated from child safety groups, which is an important step forward. right? So, Apple can't just add stuff, perhaps if coerced by a government. But we did not see a way ultimately of guaranteeing the content in the database was of this specific kind of content, nor did we see a good way of guaranteeing that Apple couldn't trivially just be pressured to add new content and disable safeguards about where the hash set has to come from. So I just want to be very careful to not oversell experimentation, much as I love experimenting.
Can I respond to something that Jonathan just said? Because I think it's really important. And I think this is something that I have found, I will admit, a little frustrating about the position, as I understand it, of folks in the both privacy and kind of technology community, which is with respect to the technical concern, there does seem to be a little bit of goalpost shifting. And I'm curious, Jonathan, what you think about my frustration here. In previous versions of encryption debates, right? The issue, as I understood it, was the government or someone is asking us to enable some feature, right? And that feature cannot be enabled, right? With the sorts of security guarantees that we all think is appropriate, right? That's a technical question. And so you should defer to the technical experts on this, right? The issue of scope creep strikes me as a different issue, right? Every society, I think, gets to determine what it views as the sort of deeply objectionable material, right, that it wants to deal with, right? I think this is certainly true when you're talking about liberal democratic societies, right, in which there is a general commitment to the rule of law and human rights, right? Now, the fact that in Europe, for example, Nazi imagery is not permitted, whereas in America, that would be core First Amendment speech, right, is interesting and an interesting point for comparative constitutional lawyers. But I don't think is something where Americans can plausibly say that this shows that the Germans and the French don't care about rights, right? It's just a different way for a liberal democracy to organize itself, right? And if that's your universe, then I think concerns about scope creep, while there are still obviously concerns, and I still want to hear what the technologists have to say about it, to me is a much less convincing type of technical objection. Because it strikes me that this is where a society can say, no, we're going to trust ourselves with this capability, right? In the way that a liberal democracy trusts itself with every capability it gives itself, right? Now, there's a separate question, of course, about the effect on other countries, right? And the concern that Apple has of like, well, look, if we do this for America or Germany or South Korea, right? Like, what are we going to do for, insert developing country here or insert China here, right? I think this raises a different question of it may not be tenable for Apple to, Apple may have to make some hard choices about whether it wants to do business in countries where it cannot expect that there will be baseline respect for the rule of law. And that's a conversation Apple has to have with its shareholders. Again, I am sort of less sympathetic to Apple's contention that it simply must operate in China, right? Or it simply must be able to operate in any country it wants to, because the market is so large. But my kind of core point is, when technologists say there is no technical solution to preventing scope creep, I take that very seriously. That's an important input into the process. But that to me strikes me as a very different and to me less compelling technical objection than there's no way to do this without creating a vulnerability that will allow hackers to come and get into all of our phones and steal all our social security numbers.
So let me suggest a couple directions for response. With respect to your observation about how this compares to prior concerns around encryption in scope creep, in my mind, well, the technical details are quite different from access to device data or ongoing access to message data. There is an important conceptual analogy, and that analogy has technical implications. When thinking about exceptional law enforcement access to a device, what you're trying to do is, or messages for that matter, what you're trying to do is punch a hole in encryption where the size of that hole is determined by the entity that's requesting access and the process they've gone through to get that access, right? So you want to punch a hole in encryption where the size of the hole is FBI plus a search warrant or something like that, right? What's different here is instead of punching a hole based on the identity of a law enforcement agency and the judicial process they've gone through, what you want to do is punch a hole based on known content with attestation from a child safety group. And the concerns that arise in many instances are overlapping, right? Making sure that the folks who pass through that hole get the plain text content, and how you authenticate the whoever's requesting that access, how you protect the hole, make sure that it isn't larger than you intend. That has a lot of analogy, a lot of connections between the two debates. Again, the technical details somewhat differ, but there are important connections there. So that's the first observation I'd make. The second, with respect to your point about differing views on speech and the appropriate scope of the public square, I think I certainly take your point that there are countries that we would very much consider vibrant democracies that just have different views on speech from how the First Amendment works in the United States. The problem here is that the moment you start making country-specific determinations, right? Okay, in the US, it's only CSAM, but in Europe, it's CSAM, this European country, it's CSAM plus Nazi imagery. In this European country, it's CSAM plus defamation or something like that, right? Those country-specific determinations become, I think, very difficult for a company to make, and it makes it very difficult for a company to defend against adding categories that we might not consider acceptable, right? Whether that's in an undemocratic country that just says, add all of these hashes because we consider it, some form of unauthorized political speech, or that middle category you identified, which may be, perhaps even harder, of countries that are democracies but troubled democracies, where there is by law a kind of speech that's outlawed, but we're very uncomfortable with it. So to give an example of that, there is a very controversial proposal in India that could affect certain political speech. Do we want Apple in the position of saying, Europe, you're allowed to identify certain political speech, we'll add to the hash set, but India, we're not going to go along with your determination about political speech. And
so I guess
a very uncomfortable position. I'll stop there.
I think this debate is really fascinating, but it relies, I think, Jonathan, on your empirical assessment or assumption or claim that Apple's cooperation with the FBI in this instance increases the probability that the same type of technology will be used, that the same databases will be used to add to the scope. So if that's not true, or rather putting it the other way, in the counterfactual where Apple doesn't develop it for the purpose of CSAM in the US, and would countries still have the motivation to make these types of requests anyways? Is that right? I mean, is this debate kind of dependent on that empirical claim?
I agree. Yes, though it is empirical in the sense of it's a political calculation, right? Apple doing business in certain countries that other companies have not been doing business in of late depends in part on their ability to forestall requests that keep coming in from those countries that they view as inconsistent with their values.
Right.
And so, to give a specific example, Apple does business in China. Google and Facebook do not currently do business in China. And it is going to foreseeably lead to more pressure than Apple's already under. They're already under quite a bit of pressure, right? They've localized user data in China, for instance. They've removed apps from the App Store that the Chinese government's demand. But they have held the line so far on broader access to user data. And so they're playing a a very dangerous political game to have access to that market. And the concern is that this move could change the calculus on the Chinese side and in turn force Apple to make some very difficult decisions where the economic incentives are very clear in favor of staying in the Chinese market. I mean, it's their number 2.
Yeah, so that's the empirical claim I mean, is that the Chinese government will change their tactics if this, given that this CSAM program exists, right? That's.
I think it's empirical in the sense that, oh, go ahead, Andrew.
I mean, there's plenty of evidence that around the world, the tech companies are under pressure from individual countries to restrict different bits of speech. I mean, Google were forced to remove the Navalny voting app during the last elections because Putin didn't want it. And they said, we'll arrest all of your, they named the staff that Google employed in Russia that they would arrest if they didn't do it. So Google actually withdrew the voting app. So these things are, this is already happening. This is already a major global discussion about how global companies based in the US predominantly manage differing demands from countries who have very different views about acceptable political speech. The difference about CSAM is there is almost global agreement on the nature of what constitutes illegal speech or illegal images. I mean, the ages may vary a bit from country to country, but predominantly there's no disagreement. So this is one area where, if you like, there is a global consensus. And that's very different to all the issues around political speech and other kinds of speech, or sexual speech in relation to, say, lesbian and gay rights, which is also heavily restricted in some countries, or et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole load of issues that companies are encountering. And I think that does make it slightly different. And it's, CSAM won't trigger this debate, these arguments. These arguments are happening. It won't trigger further attempts to impose national sovereignty, as the Russians call it, on the internet, which the Shanghai Cooperation Council have been pushing since 2011. That the concept of national sovereignty online is already out there and already being pursued by whole rafts of countries. The introduction of a piece of technology to deal with the global problem of CSAM isn't going to be, I believe, politically, geopolitically, or any other way, a significant additional factor. It's simply, I think, a scare flag that's being raised to say, we don't want this Apple to do this, to be provocative.
May I just say one quick thing in response? So I to argue against myself, I think if the United States or the liberal democratic community, right, wants Apple or Google or whomever to make these capabilities, but also wants them not to use those capabilities or be forced to use them by the Russias and Chinas and whatever of the world, the liberal democracies have to help these companies out, right? So there are ways of doing that, right? That we have not actually discussed, kind of generally policy-wise, and maybe it's time to discuss them. So, for example, to throw out something completely insane, right? We have something called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, right? A law that no one likes, right? But that serves a useful purpose of prohibiting prohibiting American companies from essentially engaging in bribery in developing nations, right? And the reason for this is because we don't want to encourage bribery in developing nations. And so this law does many things, but the most important thing it does is it gives companies a credible way of saying, no, we're not going to pay you a bribe because we literally can't, we will get arrested back at home, right? So maybe what is needed here is not a technical solution to the scope creep problem, but a set of legal and policy solutions by which a company like Apple can credibly, when it's told by China, right, you have to use this technology to help us oppress the Uyghurs, Tim Cook can say, no, you don't understand. I'll get arrested by the FBI if I do that because Congress just passed a law, right? Now, how one would write that, I have no idea. It strikes me as a very interesting, it might be my next lawfare post, right? It's a very interesting kind of set of interesting questions to think about. But that may be the way one has to go about this, because I do think, Jonathan has convinced me that there is a bigger point here than perhaps I was thinking about, but I don't think the answer can be, we're not going to do something for child CSAM because we're terrified of what China's going to do to Apple. Like if that's the concern, the United States has to stand up in some method.
Right, or in any case, there are legal responses to that problem.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm going to open up the queue. So please, audience members, raise your hand and we'll unmute you. In the meantime, Andrew, did you want to add something? It looked like you were leaning in. No, okay.
No. In fact, it's been a really interesting conversation. I really enjoyed hearing Alan and Jonathan. And I agree with Alan. I think, you know, governments have a responsibility to protect, liberal democratic governments have a responsibility to protect companies. I agree with that.
Is there anything more to say about the ability to externally monitor or audit these types of programs to understand how well they're doing on their own terms and goals?
Well, in terms of our own work, we are audited once a year by a senior judge, by a team who look at our judgments, take a selection of the images that we chose that we regard as illegal to sort of monitor whether we got it right. And we actually, on borderline images, we actually do consult a senior judge who's very experienced in the field to see if we've got it right. So we take some measures to be auditable, and we're judicially reviewable if somebody feels we've taken the wrong decision, which they don't generally, because I think we're fairly conservative in the images that we think are illegal. So I think there must be processes like that that would allow some audit of what Apple's doing or the effectiveness of the hashes they're using. And I don't know exactly the quality of the hash that Apple will end up with. That's a conversation we'd like to have with Apple, which is how they're going to ensure the quality of the neural hashes that they use as the base in the first place. Because that's obviously critical. If they've got the wrong hash, and we find, for example, that hashes that police have, we don't, or images that police have, we don't think are illegal. The police have found them to be illegal. We think they're legal images, borderline but legal. So I think the quality of that database really matters quite a lot, and we'd like to have some input into that database if Apple does proceed, or when Apple does proceed.
Interesting. Yeah. So you hold higher standards sometimes than even jurisdictions, law enforcement do.
Well, some people say narrower standards. You know, we think things are legal that law enforcement think are illegal, but that's because we consciously try and be, because, you know, the power to remove a blocking image is a very serious power in free expression terms. You want to make sure you've got it absolutely right.
Yeah. Okay. Checking the queue. It's quiet out there. Well, so let's see. Going back for a minute to the list of factors that raise risks going especially in one direction with a new program that proactively looks for contraband. Oh, right. I did want to ask Jonathan and Alan what they thought of Andrew. Andrew sort of raised implicitly a factor that we didn't have on our list yet, which is that perhaps one way to identify which contraband is worth setting up a program of this sort for is the sort that is universally recognized or nearly universally recognized across the globe as illegal material. Does that seem useful? Is that a factor that should be taken into account before expanding some kind of before using this as a precedent to set up automated detection of some other type of contraband?
I mean, it depends on it depends on what you're trying to accomplish, right? If you are concerned that creating a scanning program in the United States, let's say, will then create let's call it the China problem, right? And you think the only way to deal with that is to create a kind of backstop, and that backstop has to be credible across liberal democracies, then yes, I think it makes a lot of sense to say, CSAM, let's only CSAM, right? Because CSAM is kind of the only thing we can all agree on, right? But if you're Germany and you think that the American approach to Nazi content is crazy, right? And is, because of your own historical circumstances, every bit as offensive to you as CSAM, then the consideration is a different one. So now we get back to the empirical question that seems to be, we keep coming back to, which is what is going to be the kind of international relations effect of this, and that is a difficult thing to figure out.
Okay, one other factor that didn't make it on our list yet is actually user privacy. Is there are civil liberties groups, organizations at least, making the argument that mass scanning, even if the detection is quite valid in the sense of having low false positives and being efficacious, is per se a privacy violation. And what do the three of you think about an argument of that sort?
In short, yes. There was a report recently from several computer scientists who came at this issue from more of a privacy and free speech perspective. The title of the report, I think, speaks directly to your question. They entitled it "Bugs in Our Pockets," not subtle. And yes, there's certainly a perspective that it is different for privacy purposes to have your own device doing this sort of scanning to catch you engaged in criminal activity, and something that is uncomfortable and perhaps Orwellian. There are other concerns that I tend to focus on myself, but that particular concern certainly is articulated quite a bit.
So I think that concern is really useful to bring up. I think it's actually, I disagree with it fairly strongly. Not that this doesn't raise privacy issues, it raises enormous privacy issues. But I will admit to being a little puzzled about this focus on this distinction between cloud scanning and device scanning, right? Not on a technical level. There may be important technical differences here, but from the privacy perspective, I will admit to not understanding why that's such a big deal, right? For a number of reasons. First is that much of our life exists on the cloud. Case in point, this conversation we're having, every corporate email. I mean, just so much of our stuff exists on the cloud, right? This is true for 99% of people. Now, there are plenty of people, right, who want none of this, right? And they don't like the cloud. They're very privacy focused. But I don't think you can develop policy for that fairly vanishingly small percentage of people who are really hardcore about privacy, not because their interests aren't legitimate, but because you can't just develop global privacy for those people. This is not how it works, I think. So the first thing is, right, everything is done on the cloud, or lots of things are on the cloud, and there's an unbelievable amount of cloud scanning right now. The second thing is, it's the idea that you own your Apple device, to me, also doesn't make a ton of sense, right? Apple in particular has locked down its devices to such an extent that you control like 0.5% of the computing power of an iPhone, right? I mean, you get to do a tiny fraction of things on your iPhone. And so Apple already basically controls them. You are essentially renting a small amount of UI capabilities when you buy an Apple device, right? Now, is that good or bad? That's a different conversation. It certainly has its advantages. But the idea to me that something distinctive happens when it happens in your pocket than in the cloud, I get the intuition, I get the intuitive creepiness, but I think that intuition is unfounded, and we should resist that because there's not a big difference there for the vast, vast majority of cases.
Yeah, great.
And I just add that in international law, privacy is not an absolute right. There is no absolute right to privacy in international human rights law. Privacy does exist with some constraints that depend on the protection of the wider public interest. So the idea that you can assert, I have an absolute right to privacy to do whatever I want, to whoever I want in private, and no one has the right to know when I'm doing it. Actually, if you interrogate that, it's kind of meaningless.
Right, but even as a qualified right, I'm trying to figure out how much to weight that as a factor. It seems to me, I think my intuition, which seems to be similar with maybe most of you, is that based on the design of this program, the privacy interest is quite low, at least assuming that the false positive rate is as low as we hope and think it will be. But are there separate privacy arguments that would raise the weighting that we put on that factor? Okay, well, I don't see any hands, so let me give you each a minute to respond to the panel as our conversation as a whole, and then we'll wrap it up. Let's start with Jonathan.
Well, to close out on the sort of privacy concern being different here from server-side scanning, I just want to note that I think there are sort of two versions of the argument that strike me as the strongest versions. Again, I don't emphasize this particular argument myself, but just to articulate those perspectives. One is just a property rights view. Right? As Alan notes, you have very qualified property rights in your iPhone. And there are whole intellectual property courses taught about this. But I think the notion that your own property is being used against you resonated for many observers in a very negative way. I think there's also a connection to how you conceptualize stored data. And that's often conceptualized as a sort of sealed container. And there's a bunch of case law now about conceptualizing stored content as something that law enforcement enters, and they need a search warrant to enter, from the Warshak case on email privacy on later. And if you think about data that way, this could look like entering a private space without individualized suspicion, which is not something that is generally looked well on in the American tradition. So those are the two approaches that strike me as the two most persuasive flavors of that argument. Anyway, reflecting on the panel as a whole, I think there are at least a couple of directions where it seemed like we had consensus, notwithstanding that we come at this from different perspectives. One being the importance of data, further research and experimentation in the space, and the other being that there could be legal solutions to, or solutions perhaps is not too strong, but legal mitigation for some of the drawbacks here, whether that is a narrowly scoped law specific to Apple system or more broadly a law around holding American companies accountable when they participate in foreign surveillance or censorship, which is certainly a space where civil liberties groups have been advocating for a number of years. So thank you for the great conversation.
Great. Andrew?
Well, first, thanks for the conversation. I don't have a lot to add to what's been said. I think what was very welcome to me was the quality of the participation and the fact that we were able to have a reasonable conversation looking at the pros and cons without falling into kind of some of the more abusive language that I often see in this kind of area. So I'm very grateful for that. And I think the kind of the dangers and problems have been flagged up adequately, and some of the possible solutions have been looked at. All I'd add is that I think the tendency towards greater encryption is going to accelerate. I think more and more services will be encrypted. I think that will, from our point of view, reduce the value of URLs as detecting URLs as a method of finding CSAM, and the importance of hashing is going to increase. So the urgency, if you like, to discuss, to find both the policy and technical and legal framework in which hashes can be deployed in a more encrypted environment is going to be an increasingly important conversation. And I think this was a really great contribution to at least starting that kind of dialogue.
Yes, so mostly I just want to thank you, Jane, and Jonathan, and Andrew. This is a hard conversation to have, and I think we had it. I like to think we had it well, and I think we have to have a lot more of these like that. The one thing I will say is, I think one thing we didn't talk about a lot, but I think is worth emphasizing is the importance that it was Apple that put forward this plan, and I think that cannot be overstated. Despite the fact that Apple has gone back on it now and they're dealing with all the PR and this rollout was a disaster, and it's going to be interesting to find out how they screwed this one up in the way they did, just purely from the PR angle, because they seem to have made some mistakes they could have probably avoided. I
think it was leaked, Alan, without them at a time when they weren't expecting it to be leaked.
Leaked. Okay, and perhaps that was the main problem. Though my understanding was that they would have had plenty of time to go out to the community if they had sort of thought about doing so, and why they didn't is an interesting kind of cultural question. But the point I think that I want to emphasize is I think the fact that Apple, which if not the best in the business, is about as good as it gets, right? Can throw essentially infinite resources at this problem, has the most to lose reputationally, has some of the most ideologically committed personnel, whether from the engineering, some of which I know, from the engineering staff all the way to the top on this issue. The fact that they thought that this was a good idea and that this hit the balance correctly, I think that sets a profound precedent and really poses an enormous challenge for those who want to draw a very hard line to say that an effective solution cannot be done, right? So my prediction, right, and we will see, right, this is a prediction because I think it's useful to sharpen one's thinking by making predictions, right, is that this will be looked back as a big breakthrough in the debate. And at this point, we're just haggling over the details. Now, it may take years and years and years to get to a point. But to me, the fact that Apple was ever willing to consider this means that the adoption of something like this in the future, to me, is an inevitability. And we will see if I'm right. I of course have no idea, and what details that makes.
Jonathan, do you want to respond?
Jonathan and I have had this conversation over email a little bit.
I don't want to get into the criminology, but I do want to very quickly note that I think it is difficult to know what the broader lesson to draw is here, because the way Apple thinks about the system is it is strictly better than server-side scanning, which in certain respects it is, right? They are not actually trawling through all images that they possess. They very carefully limit which images their human review has access to on Apple servers, right? So if you think the baseline here is server-side scanning, then I think the argument for Apple's system is very different from if you think the baseline here is end-to-end encryption. And Apple itself is not positioning this currently as a technology for end-to-end encrypted environments. They've said they're not implementing it in iMessage, which is their end-to-end encrypted messaging service where you can share photos. So I just want to be very careful about what broader lesson you draw. Anyway, I apologize. I interrupted the wrap up, but I just couldn't help myself.
Of course. Okay. Thank you to the panelists. This was excellent. And we will reconvene in 15 minutes at 1:30 for our final panel today.
Thank you.